Hello again, everybody, and thanks very much for joining us once again on our Azure 101 mini-series journey. In our last session, we started to explore the ready phase of the cloud adoption framework, and we saw how this could help with successful adoption of Azure. Now, organizations need to understand their operating model, and that would then lead on how they would then plan to deploy to Azure via an Azure landing zone.
Yep, that's right, and in this video we're going to take a slightly closer look at the Azure landing zones, which are the key foundation for all of your Azure deployments. So first up will be the Start Small and Expand landing zone, which is popular choice for many organizations wanting to get into the cloud quickly and build as they go. Organizations will normally deploy their shared resources, which acts as their platform zone, into a resource group or on an Azure subscription. They will then deploy other resource groups to act as their application zone into the same subscription. So to make this a success, the organization will need to implement a baseline through their platform zone. And this is known as a minimum viable product, or MVP. And this will include all of the tools and resources needed to meet the minimum best practice. So Sam, can you take us through what we need to include in the management baselines and maybe cover off what the first one is?
Yeah, thanks, Gina. Alongside the obvious resources you'll need, such as maybe Microsoft Entra for your identity services perhaps, you'll also need to consider three key areas to create your management baselines. So these are inventory and visibility, or monitoring of your digital estate; operational compliance, so your infrastructure is actually less likely to have an outage due to maybe configuration or maybe a lack of patching; and then the ability to protect and recover, so that you can actually recover data to another site from a backup and protect against threats to your workloads with security monitoring as well. Now, arguably, inventory and visibility is an area that is probably going to be the underinvested part of this process by organizations. However, if done properly, it can actually both help prevent issues as well as report on failures so that they can actually be remediated quickly. So let's look at some of these tools to help you in the first area of inventory and visibility. You have Azure Service Health Alerts, Azure Monitor, and Azure Network Watcher. Now, Azure Monitor is a good tool for us to focus on here, and a powerful one at that, because it can actually help monitor, diagnose, and alert on changes and issues within your environment. The best bit is that if you're using the Start Small and Expand landing zone approach, Azure Monitor actually can expand and grow with you, which is a great part of the tool. You can actually start with baseline practices like virtual machine insights, which can then actually expand to using specific interactions maybe from Azure Monitor application insights. So if we think of maybe Azure Monitor like driving a car, the infrastructure is the actual car itself. However, Azure Monitor is more like a dashboard showing maybe performance metrics like CPU usage, storage capacity, but it'll also be like the warning lights on that dashboard, which are things like, showing diagnostic settings. Lastly, it would also be like the car alarm, which could be compared to alerting rules for notifying you of issues, maybe through service desk tickets or maybe bug reports being sent back to your developers' tasks, wherever this may be, whether it's Azure DevOps or maybe GitHub. Pretty cool, huh? So, Gina, what about the operational compliance? Did you want to take us through that?
It is really cool, Sam. And for operational compliance, some of the tools to use are Azure Automation Update Management for ongoing patch management, Azure Policy to enforce key policies for the environment like Deploy Defender for Cloud if it doesn't already exist. Then lastly, configuring infrastructure as code, which could be using Azure Bicep or an Azure Resource Manager template or ARM template, or even a third-party option like Terraform. So probably one of the most important from that list would be the Azure policies. This is because, yes, it can help with governance, for instance, by making sure your data is kept in a specific region, but it can also support some of the other items in our list. So for example, you could create an Azure policy which is stated that all virtual machines need to use Azure Automation Update Manager for their patching. The Azure Automation Patch Manager would just handle all of the patching process. So then this means no virtual machine is left unpatched due to misconfiguration, for example.
Great, so for protect and recovery, you have great services like Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery to help you actually recover those workloads to another site. You also have services like Microsoft Defender for Cloud for the security aspect as well. Now we're going to focus on Azure Backup at this point, as it's typically something that all businesses were going to be deploying. Azure Backup will allow you to actually define what workloads are getting protected for your backup process, and this is all done through the Business Continuity Center within the Azure portal. The platform manages which type of vault is being set up, whether that's either a backup vault or a recovery vault. You only need to actually define what the backup frequency is going to be and the retention of your data. There are advanced features like Instance Restore, for example, which will allow you to restore quicker from snapshots, but may incur a little bit of an extra charge. It's about balancing those recovery time objectives and the recovery point objectives. But don't worry, if you wanted a more in-depth look on these security tools, we have a separate video series that will cover these in more detail, so look out for that link in the video description below. Now Gina will explore how enterprise landing zones will differ from the start small and expand landing zones. So Gina, over to you.
Okay, so even though using the same resources and tools, the unit of measure is now a subscription instead of a resource group. So our platform zone, which is managed by central IT, hold our shared resources and are in separate subscriptions so that it can be independently managed and scaled. For example, they manage the identity subscription, ensuring zero trust principles are adhered to and granting only necessary roles to users that really need it. Also, roles are protected with conditional access rules, which enforce each user must use multi-factor authentication, also known as MFA, to access the environment. It extends to managing privileged roles by using privileged identity management, or it's also known as PIM, for strong time-bound authentication and full audit history of the actions carried out with the elevated role.
That's right, Gina. They would also manage other areas as well, though, like the connectivity subscription, if the Azure environment connected maybe to an on-premise environment for any reason, or maybe the management subscription for automation and monitoring purposes of that Azure environment. Lastly, though, the organisation can choose to include a specific platform team subscription for the actual central IT team to manage, which would hold things like virtual machine images or maybe the action groups that are then called for other things like alerting, for example. Then you have the individual application landing zones, which will hold the resources needed for each workload. So these are going to be typically managed by the developer team. They can include resources like virtual machines, storage accounts, disaster recovery, maybe using Azure Site Recovery, for example, or backup processes using Azure Backup. And there are many, many more. What you will notice though is that the same resources can be deployed in a platform zone subscription as well as an application zone subscription. For example, Defender for Cloud may be deployed to the management subscription so that central IT can actually manage general security recommendations. But then Defender for Cloud may be used in an application zone to use either Defender for servers or even Defender for database features. So this is why the approach will take slightly longer than the start small and expand approach, as the organization needs to be aware of the needs from the very start, prior to deployment, and then they need to configure it. But oh boy, once they do get that done, it will create a beautiful synergy between your central IT teams and your development teams to maintain the organizational governance and not hinder any of the innovation. So well worth the wait.
So there we have it, folks. That's another episode. And just to recap what we've discussed on this episode, once you know your operating model in Azure, you can look at how you will look to adopt Azure. So you will select the landing zone that works best for your business objectives based on your strategy for adopting the cloud. So you can decide if you want to adopt quickly with a minimum viable product, using start small and expand, then improve your estate over time. Alternatively, you can take a little bit more time at the start to make sure every aspect of the environment is configured and built before you migrate. And remember, the end result you should be looking to achieve is an enterprise landing zone approach, so that you can take advantage of standardisation for the central IT team while supporting innovation from your development teams. So next time we're going to be looking at the migration itself and some of the key things you need to be aware of. So see you next time.